Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Patient Perspectives podcast. My name is Lauren Schuler. In this episode, I wanted to first introduce myself and share why I'm starting a podcast, and to share a little bit of my story as I think that will illuminate some of the reasons why I'm so passionate about creating a podcast on this topic. I'm a patient with a rare disease. I currently work as a clinical assistant with prior experience in clinical research. And ultimately, my goal is to go to medical school and perhaps be a pediatric orthopedic surgeon. So, my experiences as a patient have really informed my career goals, and it's something that I hold very close to my heart. So I was inspired to start this podcast from my experiences as a patient, also connecting with other patients going through similar journeys and interactions with my medical teams. There are these two terms in healthcare, almost buzzwords, if you will, that are being used a lot, and I've heard them at conferences and literature and in other areas that have caught my attention and really kind of formed the basis for this podcast. And those terms are patient-centered care and shared decision making. To me, both of these imply either a focus on the patient or active participation and involvement from the patient. And it made me wonder how true patient-centered care and shared decision-making practices can be carried out without understanding the values that are important to patients in their care journeys. Now, there is not one set of answers to this, as each patient has individual needs and values, but one way to better understand more about what is meaningful to patients is to amplify patient voices and stories. With that, I want this podcast to not only be a resource that empowers patients to be stronger advocates for themselves in healthcare spaces by hearing from fellow patients, but also for medical professionals to gain deeper insights into what really matters to their patients, sharing ideas of what patient-centered care and shared decision-making can look like directly from those living it. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a patient with a rare disease. I was born with Conradi-Hunermann Syndrome. Broadly, this is a form of dwarfism that impacts my bones, joints, vision, hearing, skin, and my spinal cord. A common misconception is that dwarfism is just short stature, which I say just with air quotes because short stature alone does present many challenges in navigating day-to-day life. As I like to say, this world was not built for little people. However, aside from the short stature associated with dwarfism, this truly is a multisystemic condition. It has real medical impacts outside of my bones and joints. And if you're interested in the science behind it, which I certainly am, more specifically, this condition is due to a mutation of the emopamil binding protein gene, which disrupts the production of cholesterol by directly affecting the enzyme called 3-beta hydroxysteroid delta 8 delta 7 isomerase in the cholesterol biosynthetic pathway. Like most things, there is an appropriate amount of cholesterol that the body needs, or and really an optimal amount that the body needs in order to function at its best. So it's not healthy to have too much cholesterol, but it's also detrimental to the development of the body to have too little cholesterol, which is what happens in the case of Conradi. In my case, I was born with significant limb length discrepancies, scoliosis, craniofacial differences, hip dysplasia, joint contractures, an ankle deformity, a tethered spinal cord, hearing loss, and an eye condition, to name a few. I'm not sure if that encapsulates all of it. When I was born, a genetic test for Conradi-Hunermann syndrome was not available, but doctors said they believed I had a form of dwarfism based on the many characteristics that were so prominently apparent at birth. The early days were uncertain with this diagnosis. Doctors were unsure of my prognosis, what my quality of life would look like, especially as it related to my mobility. I was born at a major academic teaching hospital, so they were interested in understanding everything they could, but there just were not many answers at that time. On top of my rare disease, I'm also a quadruplet, and my siblings and I were very sick. We were born prematurely, and so understandably, the initial focus was on stabilizing us and getting us on a path to best support our critical needs rather than learning everything they could about my rare disease. So once those early days became less hectic around the time I was 2 years old, is what I think of as the start of my real care journey related to my genetic condition. At this time, my parents took me to an orthopedic surgeon to evaluate my leg length discrepancy, which was already quite significant at such a young age. And that doctor was so adamant about amputation, and unfortunately, in a very cold way, saying that amputation was the only option. And that is an interaction and an encounter that I will do a separate episode on. But my parents sought a second opinion where the next doctor, who would end up being my primary orthopedic surgeon for the past 20 years, gave us hope that I was a candidate for limb lengthening. Had my parents not sought a second opinion, that would have completely changed the trajectory of my treatment course, and my life would have looked a lot different. This is one of the reasons why I so passionately advocate for getting a second, third, fourth opinion about your medical care, and I'll speak to this and its relevance to patient-centered care in a future episode. But I had my first of 29 major surgeries at 6 years old. From a young age, I became familiar with mobility devices, casts, external fixators, all of these things that made me know I was different from my classmates and even from my siblings. There's a significant emotional, mental, and social component to growing up medically complex, which I'll dedicate another episode to because it's so crucial for medical professionals to consider these aspects when caring for patients. And I know some of my guests will talk about the importance of this as well. And while on the topic of future episodes, I decided I'm going to do separate episodes for each part or each chapter of my care because each of those has their own stories to tell, different parts of the patient-doctor relationship that I've learned. And I just feel like I can be more in depth about how those experiences have informed my perspective of patient-centered care and shared decision making if I divide it into separate episodes. So I'll likely have one episode about what it was like to go through so many surgeries as a child and the ways that it forced me to navigate the world differently. An episode about my limb lengthening journey, one about my hip surgeries, another for my spine and for my foot ankle care. So those are some things to look forward to. But one aspect of my story that I think is unique is that from a young age, I was placed in the position of being the educator to my doctors and new medical professionals that I met, since most have not heard about this condition. It affects 1 in 200,000 individuals, so many doctors may never encounter a patient with this condition at any point in their medical career. Now, when I say I was placed in the position of being the educator from a young age, I should actually clarify that my parents did most of that in the early days. I have grown substantially in my ability to advocate for myself and in how I view my care. As I continued to grow up surrounded by hospitals and procedures, my attitude towards my care shifted greatly, but that wasn't until I was 14 years old at a time when I simply went through the motions during each appointment. I was unengaged. I looked to my parents to speak for me all the time. My surgeon urged me to start taking charge of my care. And that's when I realized that living with a complex condition and disability at times placed me in a position where I had to be my strongest advocate. That's when I learned to ask questions, to be informed in the shared decision-making process, and to understand why certain treatments were recommended, and most importantly, what each one meant for my future. I made it my mission to not only be my best advocate, but also be a voice for others, which is when I began sharing my story through social media and finding ways to involve myself in patient-led advocacy groups, which brings up something that I reflect on a lot, actually, and that being the power of social media and even just the internet in general to be a resource for patients and families is incredible. Growing up, I was born in 1998, there were not online support groups or social media or websites with educational information about specific conditions and procedures. Because of that, my parents and I navigated so much of my early care alone. We had to figure everything out. That picture looks so much different now for patients, families, caregivers, and even for medical professionals to have access to literature and other important information that was not readily accessible before. Now I can go on Instagram and I can search the hashtag hip dysplasia and be connected with thousands of patients who also share their story. And I can learn about what recovery looks like from the patient perspective. I can also find reputable websites and resources that can, provide more information on what the surgery and the recovery will look like. And so it's amazing the power of social media and the internet and the ways that it can really support patient-centered care and shared decision making. So every time I reflect on that, I take away how lucky I feel to be navigating my rare disease journey at this specific point in time because there are more resources than ever right now, and my hope is that that continues to grow because knowing what it's like to navigate it all, it was me and my family navigating it as a kid, and that could be very lonely. And now it doesn't have to be a lonely experience. So, really, this is just the start. I will be diving deeper into these experiences and stories in episodes soon to come, but I hope this helps to tell my why and helps you to know me better. Next week will be a solo episode, and then the following week I'll have my first guest. So I look forward to continuing to share and connect. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating, subscribe, and comment below to keep the conversation going. New episodes drop on Spotify and YouTube every Sunday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll see you next week.